This is what happened when the richest man in town introduced the black cleaning lady as his new girlfriend. Everyone's reaction will leave you shocked. The clock read 3:45 in the morning when Maria Torres walked through the revolving doors of the imposing Montenegro building. The security guard, Don Ramon, greeted her with the familiarity that comes with age. "Early as always, Maria." The old man smiled, holding out his thermos of coffee. "It's cold this morning." "Thank you, Don Ramon." Maria wrapped her chapped hands around the thermos, grateful for the warmth. "How is your granddaughter?" "Her asthma is better now. Those medicines you recommended worked wonders." The guard looked at her with fatherly concern. "And Samuel? How is he doing?" Maria pressed her lips together, holding back her emotion. "Fighting, as always. The doctors say he'll need more treatments, but—" Her voice cracked slightly. "That boy is strong like his mother," Don Ramon said, gently squeezing her shoulder. "You'll see that he'll pull through." Maria nodded, swallowing her tears. It was not the time to cry. She had 3 floors to clean before the staff arrived, and then she had to rush to her second job at the cafeteria. The Montenegro building was different at this hour. Without the bustle of executives and the constant ringing of phones, the marble hallways seemed wider, colder. Maria pushed her cleaning cart toward the elevators, the soft squeak of the wheels echoing in the emptiness. On the 15th floor, she began her routine. As she wiped down the desks in the cubicle area, she softly hummed a lullaby, the same one she sang to Samuel every night at the hospital. "Mrs. Torres?" The voice startled her. It was Andrea, one of the executive secretaries who usually arrived early. "Good morning, Miss Andrea," Maria replied, straightening up quickly. "Could you help me? I spilled coffee on some important documents yesterday and didn't dare touch them." Andrea looked worried. "There for the 9 o'clock meeting." Of course, Maria followed her to her desk. As she worked on the stains with special products, Andrea watched nervously. "It's amazing," the secretary murmured as Maria managed to save the documents. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Years of practice," Maria smiled. "And some document restoration courses I took a while back." "Did you study?" 2 years of administration before." Maria paused. It wasn't appropriate to share her personal story. Andrea seemed to notice her discomfort. "Thanks for the help. You saved my life." At 6:30, Maria reached the top floor where the main office was located. Normally, it was the quickest area to clean, as Mr. Montenegro rarely left a mess. However, this morning the office looked like it had been the scene of a long night of work: scattered papers, empty coffee cups, even a jacket thrown over the couch. As she organized the chaos, Maria found an advanced accounting book under some papers. She picked it up curiously, flipping through the dense pages of numbers and terms she had once studied. "Accelerated depreciation," she muttered to herself, remembering her days at university. So engrossed was she in her reading that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching. "Find anything interesting?" Maria was so startled that she almost dropped the book. In the doorway stood Alejandro Montenegro, the owner of the building and one of the most powerful men in the city. Tall, with piercing green eyes and black hair flecked with premature gray, he was wearing the same suit as the day before, though considerably wrinkled. "Mr. Montenegro, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have." "Please," he interrupted her, raising a hand. "Were you reading about accelerated depreciation?" Maria felt her face heat up. It just brought back memories. "I studied management a long time ago." "Really?" Alejandro looked at her with genuine interest, approaching her desk. "What do you think of the straight line method versus the sum of digit method?" Maria hesitated. Was it a test? Was he mocking her? But Alejandro's gaze seemed genuinely curious. "Well," he began hesitantly, "the straight line method is simpler and more widely accepted, but in my opinion, the sum of digit method better reflects the reality of depreciation in certain assets, especially in technology and heavy machinery." Alejandro raised his eyebrows, visibly impressed. He sat on the edge of his desk, completely forgetting the social differences between them. "Go on," he encouraged her. For the next hour, they had a deep conversation about accounting, finance, and management. Maria surprised Alejandro with her knowledge and understanding of complex topics, while he captivated her with practical cases from his experience. "Why did you leave university?" he finally asked. The question hit Maria like a bucket of cold water, bringing her back to reality. She looked at her watch and paled. "My God, it's 8 o'clock. I should be at my other job." "Another job? How many do you have?" "3, Maria answered as she hurriedly gathered her cleaning supplies. "Morning shift here, waitressing in the afternoons, and cleaning at a clinic on the weekends." "Why?" Maria paused at the door, hesitating. Something in Alejandro's gaze made her answer honestly. "My son is sick. Leukemia. The treatments are expensive." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken emotions. Finally, Alejandro spoke. "How about we continue this conversation over lunch?" Maria looked at him in surprise. "Mr. Montenegro, Alejandro," he corrected her. "And it's not an inappropriate proposition. It's a conversation between two people who enjoy discussing accelerated depreciation." He smiled, and for the first time, Maria noticed that his green eyes had little wrinkles at the corners when he did so. "I can't," he replied softly. "I have to go to the hospital during my lunch break." "Then I'll take lunch to the hospital," she replied without hesitation, "if you'll allow me." Maria knew she should say no. It was inappropriate, dangerous even. She was the cleaning lady, he owned the building. They belonged in different worlds. "Samuel likes hamburgers," she found herself saying instead, "when he can eat them." Alejandro's smile widened. "Burgers are my specialty." That was the beginning. No one could have predicted that a conversation about depreciation methods at 7 in the morning would change their lives forever. Over the next 3 months, Alejandro became a constant presence in Maria and Samuel's lives. He would come to the office early to discuss business matters with her while she cleaned. He would show up at the hospital with hamburgers and adventure books for Samuel. He would listen to her talk about her interrupted dreams and deepest fears. Maria watched him interact with his son, teaching him board games and helping him with his hospital homework. She watched as Alejandro, the feared business tycoon, sat on the floor to play with cars, not caring about ruining his designer suits. Love grew slowly, in whispered conversations in hospital hallways, in shared laughter over cups of cheap coffee, in glances that lasted a second longer than necessary. Neither sought it out, neither expected it, but there it was, growing in the spaces between their very different worlds. The bombshell exploded 3 months later at Empresas Montenegro's annual gala. Maria had initially declined the invitation, but Alejandro insisted. "I want you to be there," he told her. "There's something important I need to do." She accepted, not knowing that that night would change everything. No one was prepared for what happened when Alejandro Montenegro, the richest man in town, took the microphone and introduced the cleaning lady as the love of his life. The silence that followed was deafening. The 500 guests at the gala froze with champagne glasses halfway to their lips. Maria, beautiful in a simple navy blue dress Alejandro had insisted on giving her, felt the air leave her lungs. "As many of you know," Alejandro continued, his firm voice echoing in the silent room, "I have never been one to follow social conventions, and tonight will be no exception." In the front row, Beatriz Montenegro, the family matriarch, clutched her pearl necklace so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Alejandro, sit down immediately," she hissed through gritted teeth, but her son ignored her. "In this woman," he continued, extending his hand toward Maria, "I have found more intelligence, dignity, and strength than in all of the board meetings combined." A murmur of indignation ran through the room. Isabella Montero, Alejandro's ex-fiancée, dropped her glass, the crystal shattering against the marble floor. "The maid?" Isabella's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Did you have us here to introduce us to your maid?" "No, Isabella," Alejandro replied with icy calm. "I had them here to introduce them to the woman I love." Maria felt her legs tremble. This was not what they had planned. It was supposed to be a discreet introduction, not this public declaration that shook the foundations of high society. "My son," Beatrice interjected, standing up. "If this is a way to rebel against the family." "No, Mother. This is a way to be honest, for the first time in my life." At that moment, Maria's phone vibrated in her small bag. It was the hospital. Panic instantly took over her. "Samuel?" she whispered into the phone, taking a few steps away from the podium. The nurse's voice sounded worried. "Mrs. Torres, we need you to come. Samuel has a high fever." Maria looked at Alejandro, who was still defending her in front of the hostile crowd. He caught her gaze and immediately understood that something was wrong. "If you'll excuse me," he said, interrupting his own speech, "there are more important matters to attend to than your prejudices." He took Maria's hand and, before the astonished gaze of those present, they both headed towards the exit. The camera flashes began to explode like lightning. The invited journalists had smelled blood in the water. "Alejandro Montenegro," one shouted, "is it true that your new girlfriend is a cleaning lady?" "Miss, how did you meet the businessman? Is this a publicity strategy?" Alejandro shielded Maria with his body as they made their way through the crowd. His driver was already waiting with the car running. To the central hospital, Alejandro ordered as soon as the doors closed. Maria was shaking. "I'm so sorry. This is a disaster. Your reputation." "My reputation doesn't matter," he interrupted, taking her hands. "Samuel comes first, always." As the car sped through the city, Maria looked out the window at the nightlights blurred by the speed. In just a few hours, her quiet, anonymous life had become the scandal of the year. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. Alejandro looked at her, his green eyes shining with determination. "Of falling in love with you? Never. The way I announced it, maybe I could have been more diplomatic." A small laugh escaped Maria's lips, mixed with a suppressed sob. "My world is going to make your life miserable," he warned. "Your world was already making my life miserable," she replied. "At least now I have an ally." The car stopped in front of the emergency entrance. Before they got off, Alejandro stopped her for a moment. "Maria," his voice was soft but firm, "no matter what happens after tonight, I want you to know that every word I said there is true. I love you. You and Samuel." She looked at him, this man who had turned her world upside down of his own free will, who had risked everything for her and her son. "I love you too," she whispered, "and that terrifies me more than all your enemies put together." As they ran to Samuel's room, neither of them imagined the storm that was coming. The scandal of that night was only the beginning. The true test of their love had just begun. And somewhere in the city, in the Montenegro mansion, Beatrice picked up her phone to make a call that would change the fate of everyone. "Fernando? Yes, I need you to investigate everything about a certain Maria Torres. Everything. And I need you to find something. Anything that can keep her from my son." The first domino had fallen. The game began. The news exploded in the papers the next morning. "Montenegro here presents cleaner as his partner," screamed the headlines. Pictures of Maria and Alejandro leaving the gala filled the covers of society magazines. "Have you seen this?" asked Carmen, one of the cleaning ladies, handing the paper to Maria as she arrived for work. "I don't read trash," Maria replied curtly, adjusting her uniform. "They say you cast a spell on Mr. Montenegro," Carmen continued, following her down the hall, "that you used your sick son to manipulate him." Maria stopped short. "Be careful what you say about my son, Carmen." "I'm just repeating what they say." "Maria," Don Ramon's voice cut through the tension. "They're looking for you at the front desk." In the lobby, an elegant middle-aged woman was waiting for her. Her rigid posture and calculating gaze made Maria tense instantly. "Mrs. Torres," the woman smiled without warmth. "I'm Victoria Andrade, Isabella's mother." Maria felt a chill. Isabella Montero had been Alejandro's fiancée until 6 months ago. "How can I help you?" Victoria pulled an envelope out of her designer purse. "I've come to make you an offer. Inside this envelope is a check for $500,000. I'm not interested. It's enough to pay for all of your son's treatments, Victoria continued, as if she hadn't heard her. You could send him to the best clinics in the world. Maria took a step back. Mrs. Andrade, I appreciate your concern for my son, but I must decline. Be realistic, dear. Victoria's voice hardened. How long do you think this will last? Do you really think Alejandro Montenegro will marry the woman who cleans his offices? What Alejandro and I have is none of your business. Anything involving the Montenegro family is my business, Victoria hissed. My daughter will be the next Mrs. Montenegro, as planned. You are just a passing fancy. If you'll excuse me, I have work to do. The check will be available for 24 hours, Victoria called as Maria walked away. After that, things will get unpleasant. Maria kept her composure until she reached the second-floor bathroom. There, she finally let the tears fall. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from Alejandro. Are you okay? I was told about Victoria's visit. Don't let them intimidate you. I love you. Before she could respond, another employee entered the bathroom. Maria, Mr. Fernando Mendez wants to see you in his office. Fernando Mendez was Alejandro's oldest partner, practically his mentor. Maria wiped away her tears and went up to the executive floor. Come in, a voice called as he knocked on the door. Fernando Mendez stood by the window, looking out over the city. He was an imposing man in his 60s with silver hair and shrewd eyes. Maria Torres, he said her name slowly, as if savoring it. We finally meet formally. Something in his voice triggered a distant memory in Maria. She had seen him before, years ago, but where? Sit down, please, Fernando instructed. You know, I've been doing some research on you, Maria Torres, born in the Southern District, father deceased mother. Oh, your mother worked in the textile industry, right? The color drained from Maria's face. She remembered now. You, she whispered. You were the man with the briefcase. Fernando smiled. I'm glad you remember me. You destroyed my family. Maria's voice trembled. The factory where my mother worked. You bought the shares and then closed it, paying no severance. Business is business, darling. My mother died working 3 jobs to pay off the debts she left us. Fernando sat behind his desk, unfazed. And now you do the same. History repeats itself. What do you want from me? Stay away from Alejandro. His voice turned icy. Or I'll be forced to remind him of certain details about the bankruptcy of that factory that might interest him. Maria stood up. Don't threaten him through me. It's not a threat, it's a fact. Do you think he'll love you when he finds out that your family tried to sue Empresas Montenegro? When he finds out that your mother died cursing this family name? My mother died because of him, not the Montenegros. Are you sure? Fernando smiled again. Check the bankruptcy papers. Find out who signed the final closing order. Maria left the office on shaky legs. In the hallway, she came face to face with Isabella Montero. Well, well, Isabella smiled wickedly. Cinderella herself. I don't have time for this. Oh, but you should make time. Isabella followed her. Did you know that Alejandro and I had dinner together last week? Maria kept her stride steady, even though her heart raced. He told me he's confused, Isabella continued, that this all happened too fast. You're lying. Why would I? Unlike you, I don't need to lie to keep a man. Maria stopped and faced Isabella. If Alejandro wanted to be with you, he would be. But he's not. That must hurt you a lot, right? Isabella's smile froze. This isn't over, maid. You're right, Maria replied. It's just beginning. The rest of the day passed in a haze of tension. Every glance, every whisper seemed like a threat. Maria tried to contact Alejandro several times, but he was in meetings all day. In the evening, while cleaning the boardroom, she found a forgotten folder. Opening it, her blood ran cold. It was the bankruptcy papers for the factory where her mother worked. And there, on the last page, was the signature Fernando had mentioned. Alejandro Montenegro Sr., Alejandro's father, had signed the closure order. Maria sat heavily in a chair, the papers shaking in her hands. How could she look Alejandro in the eye knowing that his family had destroyed hers? Her phone rang. It was the hospital. Samuel had asked about her. She put the documents in her bag and headed for the exit. In the lobby, the news screens showed her photo alongside sensational headlines. Who is Maria Torres really? Ex-fiancé claims Alejandro Montenegro was deceived. Scandal in the business elite. Don Ramon stopped her before leaving. Maria, there are journalists outside. Many. I have to go to the hospital. Use the service exit, the guard suggested. I'll get you a taxi there. As she waited for the elevator to go down to the parking lot, Maria received another message. This time, it was an unknown number. We have proof of your past. Either you disappear from Alejandro's life, or tomorrow everything will come to light. The elevator doors opened and Maria entered, not noticing the figure watching her from the shadows of the parking lot. The war had begun, and she was in the center of the battlefield. In the taxi on the way to the hospital, Maria checked her phone. She had 15 missed calls, most of them from unknown numbers. Journalists, most likely. Among them, there were 3 from Alejandro. Mom? Samuel's voice greeted her as she entered the hospital room. Is it true what they say on TV? Maria stopped dead in her tracks. Someone had left the TV on the news channel. What things, my love? That Alejandro is your boyfriend. Samuel smiled weakly. And that's why we won't be able to see him anymore. Who told you that? Maria sat by his bed, stroking his thinning hair from chemotherapy. A very elegant lady came. She said she was Alejandro's mother. Maria's heart stopped for a second. Beatriz Montenegro was here? Yes. She brought me this video game. Samuel pointed to a new console on the table. But he said mean things about you, Mom, that you were a opportunist. Samuel, look at me. Maria took her son's face in her hands. What do you think of me? That you're the best mom in the world, she replied without hesitation, and that Alejandro smiles more when he's with you. Tears threatened to spill from Maria's eyes when the door opened. It was Alejandro. Champion, she greeted Samuel, but her smile faded at the sight of the console. Where did that come from? Your mom brought it, Maria replied, her voice tense. Alejandro cursed under his breath. Maria, we need to talk. Not now. It's important. Fernando quit this afternoon. Maria felt the ground shift beneath her feet. What? After 30 years as a partner, he quit without explanation. Alejandro ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. Something's going on, and I think it has to do with you. With me? Maria tried to keep her voice from shaking. Why would it have anything to do with me? Alejandro, Samuel interrupted, oblivious to the tension. Do you want to see my new level in the game? For the next hour, they pretended normality for Samuel. They played, they laughed, and for a moment, they seemed like a normal family. But when the nurse came for the nighttime medications, reality caught up with them. I'll wait for you outside, Alejandro murmured to Maria. In the hospital hallway, the fluorescent lights made everything seem starker, more real. My mother came to see Samuel, Alejandro began. I know. And Victoria Andrade came to see you. So did Fernando Mendez, Maria added. Alejandro punched the wall in frustration. They're all plotting against us. No, Maria pulled the papers out of her purse. They're protecting you from me. What are you talking about? Your father. Maria handed him the papers with shaking hands. He signed the order that destroyed my family 10 years ago. Alejandro read the documents in silence. His face darkened. The textile factory in the Southern District, he murmured. I remember that case. It was one of the last businesses my father closed before he died. My mother worked there. Maria's voice cracked. We lost everything. She died working low-paying jobs to cover the debts. That's why I had to drop out of college. Maria, No, she interrupted him. Don't say you're sorry. It's not your fault. But you needed to know. Is that why Fernando quit? Did he threaten you with this? Maria nodded. He was there. the day they closed the factory. He was the one who carried out the order. Alejandro took her by the shoulders. Listen to me carefully. What my father did, what Fernando did, doesn't change how I feel about you. It should. Why? Because your family destroyed mine. Maria finally let out the pent-up pain. How can we build something on those ruins? Because we are not our parents. Alejandro pulled her close. Because what we have is stronger than the past. At that moment, Maria's cell phone vibrated. It was another message from the unknown number. Last warning. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., everything will be in the media. You still have time to disappear. More threats? Alejandro asked, reading over her shoulder. They've been coming all day. Let them publish what they want. Alejandro kissed her forehead. They can't destroy us if we stay together. But Maria wasn't so sure. Deep down, she knew the storm was just beginning. Fernando Mendez wasn't the kind of man to give up without a plan, and Beatriz Montenegro didn't visit children in hospitals out of kindness. Something big was coming, and Maria feared that not even Alejandro's love would be enough to protect them. Mom? Samuel's voice came from the bedroom. Can they come back? I feel alone. Maria and Alejandro exchanged a glance before returning to the boy. For now, this moment of peace was all they had. In his office, meanwhile, Fernando Mendez turned on his computer. On the screen glowed an email addressed to every major media outlet in the country. The subject: the real Maria Torres, the swindler behind the Montenegro scandal. His finger hovered over the send button. I'm sorry, Alejandro, he muttered, but this is for your own good. The cursor blinked, waiting for the command that would unleash chaos. The morning dawned gray and cold. Maria arrived at the Montenegro offices early, as always, but something was different. The security guards avoided her gaze, and a tense silence filled the hallways. Maria, Don Ramon stopped her at the entrance. His face showed concern. Have you seen the news? Before she could answer, Andrea, the executive secretary, came running. Maria, Mr. Montenegro needs you in his office. Immediately. The elevator had never seemed so slow. When the doors opened on the top floor, Maria found Alejandro standing in front of a television screen. His face was pale. In an exclusive investigation, the presenter said, we have discovered that Maria Torres, the controversial partner of businessman Alejandro Montenegro, has a dark past linked to fraud and scams. Turn it off, Alejandro ordered when he noticed her presence. Is it true? Maria asked, his voice barely a whisper. Of course not, Alejandro approached her. Fernando is behind this. He's leaked manipulated documents to the press. But why? Because I found something. Alejandro led her to his desk, where several folders were scattered. Something I shouldn't have seen. Maria picked up one of the documents. They were financial reports for the Montenegro companies, but there was something odd about them. These numbers, she muttered, her years of study in accounting kicking in, they don't add up. Exactly. Alejandro pointed to several columns. There are millions diverted to ghost accounts, and all the documents have Fernando's signature. He's stealing from the company? Not only that, Alejandro pulled out more papers. He's diverting funds from social projects, hospitals, schools, community centers. Maria's heart stopped. Hospitals? Including where Samuel is, Alejandro confirmed. Funding for oncology drugs has been systematically cut for years. Maria slumped into a chair, reality hitting her like an avalanche. That's why there's always a shortage of medicines. That's why there are so many children. Fernando has been using the social projects as a front to enrich himself. Alejandro's voice shook with rage. And when I started asking questions, he decided to destroy you to distract me. Mr. Montenegro, Andrea's voice cut in over the intercom. The board of directors is calling for an emergency meeting. Now. Alejandro cursed. They're panicking over the news. Go, Maria said. I need to think. Maria, Alejandro took her hand. Don't do anything rash. I'm just going to look over these documents. Maybe I'll find something that will help. For the next few hours, Maria dove into the financial reports. Her incomplete accounting studies proved to be a blessing. Slowly, the pattern began to emerge. "It can't be," she muttered to herself. The sound of the door startled her. It was Fernando Mendez. "I see Alejandro showed you the documents," he said calmly, as if he hadn't orchestrated a smear campaign against her that very morning. "How could he?" Maria stood up. "There are children dying in that hospital." "Business is business," Fernando shrugged. "As I told your mother 10 years ago." "My mother was right about you. You're a monster." "No, my dear, I'm a practical man." Fernando stepped up to the desk. "And now you have a practical decision to make." "What does he mean?" "Right now, the board of directors is voting to oust Alejandro from his own company," Fernando smiled, "unless someone confesses to manipulating financial documents to blackmail him." Maria felt the air leave her lungs. "He wants me to blame him." "It would be best for everyone, don't you think? Alejandro keeps his company, I keep my reputation, and you." Her smile turned predatory. "Well, you could receive generous compensation. Enough for Samuel's full treatment abroad." "Are you bribing me to blame him for his crimes?" "I'm offering you a dignified exit." Fernando pulled an envelope from his jacket. "This is a ticket to Spain. For you and Samuel, you leave tonight." Maria took the envelope with shaking hands. "And if I refuse?" "Then the documents proving your alleged involvement in previous frauds will be coming to the police." Fernando headed for the door. "Oh, and by the way, the hospital called. New medications for Samuel are delayed indefinitely." The threat hung in the air like poison. When Fernando left, Maria collapsed into Alejandro's chair. Tears ran freely down her face as she looked at the photos on the desk. A recent one, of the three of them together in the hospital, Samuel smiling despite the tubes and machines. Her phone rang. It was the hospital. "Mrs. Torres, I regret to inform you that there has been a problem with Samuel's insurance. Apparently, his coverage has been canceled." Maria closed her eyes. Fernando was making good on his threats one by one. The sound of commotion outside the office made her stand up. Through the glass doors, she could see the board members leaving the meeting room. Some were shouting, others were gesticulating furiously. Alejandro was the last to leave. When he saw her through the glass, her face said it all. "I've been given an ultimatum," he said as he entered the office. "Either I'm done with you, or I lose the company." "I know," Maria pointed at the documents. "Fernando was here." "What?" Alejandro paled. "What did he say to you?" Maria hesitated. Every word Fernando had said had been a stab, but the real wound was knowing he was right. She was Alejandro's weak point, the chink in his armor. "Maria," Alejandro knelt in front of her. "Whatever he told you, we'll face it together. It's not that simple." Maria pulled the tickets out of the envelope. "She wants me to leave, to confess to tampering with the documents." "That's ridiculous." "It's practical." Maria's voice sounded distant, even to herself. "You keep your company, he keeps his reputation, and Samuel." "No." Alejandro took her face in his hands. "Don't you dare consider this." "They've canceled Samuel's insurance." The tears welled up again. "Without treatment, We'll find another way." "Which one?" Maria stood up, walking away from him. "You're going to sacrifice everything for us? Your company? Your family legacy?" "To hell with the legacy." Alejandro slammed the desk. "I love you. I love Samuel. Isn't that enough?" "Love doesn't pay for cancer treatments." Maria reached for her purse. "Nor does it save companies." "Maria, please." "I need time to think." He headed for the door. "Please don't follow me." In the hallway, glances of pity and contempt followed her to the elevator. The entire building must have already known about the meeting, about the ultimatum. In her bag, the documents proving Fernando's frauds weighed like lead. She held the truth in her hands, but what good was the truth when her son's life was at stake? The phone rang again. This time, it was a message from Fernando. "You have until midnight to decide. After that, the consequences will be irreversible." Maria looked at the time. 6:00 p.m. 6 hours to decide between destroying the man she loved or saving her son. The truth, she discovered, could be the cruelest weapon of all. Maria walked aimlessly through the streets of the financial center. The skyscrapers rose like glass giants, indifferent to her dilemma. Her phone kept vibrating. Calls from Alejandro, messages from the hospital, reminders from Fernando. Finally, her steps took her to the only place where she always found clarity, the hospital chapel. "Mom?" Samuel was awake when she entered his room. "You've been crying." "No, my love," Maria tried to smile. "I'm just tired." "You lie just like when you say the hospital food is good," Samuel grimaced. "Is it because of Alejandro?" Maria sat on the edge of the bed. "How are you feeling today?" "The nurse says I need more medicine." Samuel played with the edge of his sheet. "But there isn't any, like always." Maria's heart contracted. "Samuel, what would you think if we had to go far away?" "With Alejandro?" "No, my love, just the two of us." Samuel was silent for a moment. "Is it because of the bad things they say about you on TV?" "It's complicated." "Adults always say that when they don't want to explain things," Samuel frowned. "But I understand more than they think." "What do you understand?" "That sometimes bad people make good people look bad." Samuel looked at her with a wisdom beyond his years. "Like when the big kids used to tease me at school and then say I started it." Mary felt the tears come back to her eyes. "You're very smart, you know." "And you're very good, Mom." Samuel took her hand. "That's why Alejandro loves you, and that's why Mr. Fernando wants you to leave." Mary froze. "How do you know about Fernando?" "I heard him talking to the fancy lady, Alejandro's mom." Samuel lowered his voice. "They didn't know I was awake. They said mean things about you and about important papers that could hurt Alejandro." "Samuel, what else did you hear?" "That if you left, they would make sure I got the best treatment." Samuel squeezed her hand. "But I don't want you to go, Mom. I don't want you to be sad like you were before you met Alejandro." Maria hugged her son, tears flowing freely now. "I love you so much, my life." "I love you too, Mom." Samuel hugged her back. "And I love Alejandro too. He's like the dad I never had." A knock on the door interrupted them. It was Andrea, Alejandro's secretary. "Maria, sorry to come like this, but it's urgent." Andrea was breathless. "You have to see this." She handed her a tablet where a security video was playing. On it, Fernando and Beatriz Montenegro were clearly seen in an office, discussing the details of their plan against Maria. "Where did you get this?" "The IT team found it while reviewing the security footage for another matter," Andrea explained. "There's more, much more." Maria looked at Samuel, who had gone back to playing with his console, and then at the clock. 9:30 p.m. She still had time. "Andrea, I need you to help me with something." Maria pulled the documents out of her bag. "And I need no one to know you were here." "What are you going to do?" "The right thing." Maria kissed Samuel's forehead. "For the first time in my life, I'm going to fight instead of run away." As Andrea walked out with the documents, Maria received a new message from Fernando. 3 hours, Maria. Time is running out." Maria looked at her son, took a deep breath, and replied, "Let's meet at his office. I have a counteroffer to make." The truth could be a cruel weapon, but in the right hands, it could also be justice. In his top-floor office, Fernando Mendez smiled as he read the message. He didn't know he was about to face his worst nightmare, a mother who had nothing left to lose. The night was just beginning, and with it, the true battle for the soul of Empresas Montenegro. The first light of dawn found Maria in her small apartment, surrounded by old documents and files. She hadn't slept all night, but her eyes shone with renewed determination. "Good morning, Mrs. Torres," Andrea greeted, entering with 2 coffees. "I brought the last files you asked for." "Did anyone see you?" "No. I used the service entrance as you suggested." Andrea sat down across from her. "Did you find anything?" Maria spread out several documents on the kitchen table. "Look at these dates." Every time Fernando diverted funds from the hospital, it coincided with an anonymous donation to a foundation in the Cayman Islands. And that helps us? It gives us the pattern. Maria pointed to more papers. But the important thing is this. Andrea took the document from Maria, and her eyes widened in surprise. Is this proof that Fernando wasn't acting alone? Maria smiled humorlessly. And that I have more right to be in that company than everyone thinks. Maria's phone rang. It was Alejandro. Where are you? His voice sounded worried. I've been looking for you all night. I needed time to think. The board wants an answer today, Alejandro sighed. Fernando is pushing for a no-confidence vote. I know. Could you gather everyone in the boardroom at 10? Maria, what are you planning? Trust me. Maria looked at the clock. 7:30 a.m. Just make sure everyone is there, especially your mother and Fernando. After hanging up, Maria headed to her room. At the back of her closet, in a box she hadn't opened in years, she found what she was looking for: an old photo album and a yellowed envelope. Is that? Andrea asked from the doorway. The last letter from my mother. Maria caressed the envelope, and the key to understanding everything. At 9:45, Maria entered the Montenegro building for the last time, but this time she wasn't wearing her cleaning uniform. Instead, she was wearing a black business suit that Alejandro had given her for the gala. Maria, Don Ramon stopped her at the entrance. There are reporters outside. I know. Let them in at 10:30. But the rules. Trust me, Don Ramon, Maria smiled. After today, a lot of things are going to change. In the elevator, Maria mentally reviewed her plan. Everything depended on the next few minutes. The boardroom was full when she entered. The entire board of directors, Beatriz Montenegro, Fernando, and even Isabella and her mother were present. What is she doing here? Victoria Andrade hissed. I invited her, Alejandro replied, standing up. This is a private meeting, Fernando interjected. Miss Torres has no authority to. Actually, Maria interrupted, I have more authority than you think. She placed her briefcase on the table and began pulling out documents. 10 years ago, he began, the textile factory in the Southern District mysteriously went bankrupt. Hundreds of workers lost everything. That's ancient history, Beatriz dismissed. Not so ancient. Maria spread a photo across the table. This is my mother, Elena Velasco, the day she was told the factory was closing. Velasco? Beatriz Montenegro paled. I see you recognize the name, Mrs. Montenegro. Maria smiled humorlessly. As you should. After all, the Velascos were founding partners of Empresas Montenegro. A murmur ran through the room. Fernando shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My mother wasn't just another worker, Maria continued. She was the legitimate heir to the Velasco part of the company. That part mysteriously disappeared during the restructuring that you, Mr. Mendez, orchestrated. That's ridiculous. Fernando stood up. The Velascos sold their shares years ago. Really? Maria pulled out more documents. Because according to these papers, signed by my grandfather, the shares were to go to my mother, papers that you hid when she died. This is a fabrication, Beatriz shouted. Alejandro, you can't believe these lies. Lies? Maria pulled out her mother's letter. This letter was written by my mother before she died. In it, she details how Fernando Mendez and you, Mrs. Montenegro, conspired to steal her inheritance. And not only that, she added, projecting the security video on the screen, they've been siphoning off funds from social projects for years, including from the hospital where my son is fighting for his life. The silence that followed was deafening. This is absurd. Fernando tried to remain calm. They have no proof. No? Maria smiled. Andrea, could you please let our guests in? The doors opened and several men in suits entered. I present to you the auditors from the Securities Commission, Maria introduced them. They have been very interested in reviewing these documents. Chaos broke out in the room. Fernando tried to flee, but the security guards stopped him. Beatriz Montenegro fainted in her chair. There are also representatives from various media outlets here, Maria continued. I think it's time for the truth to come out, don't you think? Maria, Alejandro looked at her with a mixture of astonishment and admiration. Why didn't you tell me? Because I needed to protect you, Maria took his hand, as you have protected me. The next few days were a whirlwind of headlines and revelations. Fernando Mendez was arrested. Beatriz Montenegro resigned from her position on the board of directors. And Maria, the woman everyone had scorned, was recognized as the legitimate heir to a significant part of Empresas Montenegro. But the real miracle came a week later, when the recovered funds allowed the hospital to receive all the necessary medicines. Samuel and other children would finally have the treatment they deserved. You know, Alejandro said one afternoon as they watched Samuel play in his hospital room, now equipped with everything he needed. My father would be proud. Of what? Of finally having the Montenegros and the Velascos united, she smiled, although not in the way he expected. Maria rested her head on his shoulder. Do you think it will work, running the company together? I think you have already proven yourself to be a better leader than all of us. Alejandro kissed her forehead. Besides, we have a more important mission. Which one? To make sure no other child goes through what Samuel went through. Alejandro pulled an envelope from his jacket. That's why I want you to see this. Inside were plans for a new pediatric cancer center. The Samuel Torres Montenegro Foundation, Maria read, tears blurring her vision. Are you serious? As serious as I love you. Alejandro knelt in front of her. And as serious as this question, Maria Velasco Torres, would you do me the honor of being my wife? The story that had begun with a cleaning lady reading an accounting book ended with a united family, a transformed company, and the promise of a better future for those who needed it most. Because sometimes, true love doesn't just change two lives, it has the power to change the entire world. The impact on society was immediate. The media, which had previously crucified Maria, now presented her as a symbol of justice and perseverance. Stories of her fight against corporate corruption inspired others to speak out. Have you seen this? Samuel asked one morning, showing a magazine to his mother. They say you're a heroine. Maria smiled as she adjusted the pillows on her hospital bed. The only heroine here is Nurse Teresa, who puts up with you when you don't want to take your medicine. But it's true, Samuel insisted. The other kids on the floor say their treatments came about because of you. And now there are more doctors and better machines. That's all thanks to the money we recovered, my love. And because you kicked the bad guys' asses, Alejandro added, entering the room with a giant teddy bear. Alejandro, Maria scolded him. Don't teach her those expressions. What? It's the truth, he smiled, handing the teddy to Samuel. By the way, the developer called. The land for the new cancer center is ready. Samuel's eyes brightened. Can I come see? When the doctors say you're stronger, Maria promised. Also, we need your opinion on the colors. It's your foundation, after all. Can I put in a video game room? We'll see, Alejandro laughed. First, we need your mother to say yes to something else. Maria felt heat rise to her cheeks. The engagement ring was still waiting for an answer. Mom, Samuel looked at her seriously. Why haven't you answered, Alejandro? Things aren't that simple, my love. Adults always say that. Samuel rolled his eyes. But it's very simple. You love him, he loves you, and I love you both. What else do you need? Just then, a nurse came in with the results of Samuel's latest tests. The numbers are good, the nurse smiled. The new medication is working perfectly. See? Samuel smiled triumphantly. Everything is better now. You have no excuses anymore, Mom. Maria looked at her son, then at Alejandro. The two men in her life were looking at her with identical, hopeful expressions. Okay, she sighed with a smile. Yes, Alejandro Montenegro, I will marry you. The celebration was interrupted by the sound of applause from the hallway. The other children on the floor and their parents had gathered at the door, along with doctors and nurses. It's about time, Nurse Teresa exclaimed. We were making bets on when you would say yes. The news spread quickly. That evening, the newscasts announced, here is Velasco and Montenegro magnate announce their engagement. In her office, meanwhile, Beatriz Montenegro looked out at the city from her window. Above her desk, an old photograph showed two young couples, she and her husband with Maria's parents. "You were right, Elena," she murmured to the image of Maria's mother. "Your daughter is exactly what this company needed." The wedding took place 6 months later, when Samuel was strong enough to walk down the aisle as best man. The ceremony was intimate, but the reception turned into a charity gala to raise funds for the new cancer center. "You know what's the funniest thing?" Maria commented that night, dancing with her now husband. "What?" "That it all started because I stayed up late reading an accounting book." Alejandro laughed. "No, my love. It all started because you had the courage to be yourself, no matter what the world thought." From his table, Samuel watched them with a smile. Beside him, Don Ramon, the security guard who was now the head of security at the new hospital, winked at him. "Your mom and Alejandro are special, huh?" "Yes," Samuel nodded. "They're like those stories where the prince falls in love with the common girl, except that mom turned out to be a princess after all." "And the bravest of all," Don Ramon added. The story of Maria and Alejandro became a legend in the city. Not only because of the romance between the tycoon and the lost heiress, but because of how that love had transformed a corrupt company into a beacon of hope for many. Because sometimes, destiny takes strange paths to take us exactly where we need to be. And in a hospital room, a forgotten ledger had been the first step on that path. The end.